The blood on Victoria Vaughan's porch had been there since Tuesday morning, and now it was Friday night, and she could still smell the iron tang of it mixing with the high-altitude pine when the wind blew just right through Leadville, Colorado. She stood at her bedroom window, a Winchester rifle clutched in trembling hands, watching the darkness beyond her small homestead with eyes that had not known real sleep in 6 weeks. Not since the first man had come in the night with whiskey on his breath and violence in his intentions. Leadville sprawled beneath the stars like a living contradiction in this summer of 1881. A mining town that had exploded from nothing to 30,000 souls in just a few years, drawing fortune seekers and desperados in equal measure to these mountains that promised silver and delivered suffering just as often. Victoria had come here 2 years ago with her father, a mining engineer who had died in a cave-in at the Little Johnny mine 8 months past, leaving her with this house on the outskirts of town, 40 acres of rocky land, and the kind of beauty that made men forget their manners and sometimes their humanity. She was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and green eyes that her mother had once said could see straight through to a person's soul. Her mother had been wrong about that, because Victoria had not seen the darkness in the first man who came until he was already trying to break down her door. She had fired a warning shot that night and he had fled, but he had not been the last. The second man came 3 nights later. The third came the night after that. They came alone, emboldened by whiskey and the knowledge that she lived out here without protection, without family, without anyone who would hear her scream. She had fired more warning shots, had stood on her porch and shouted into the darkness that she would kill the next man who set foot on her property. But they kept coming, different men with the same hungry eyes and the same assumption that a woman alone was a woman available. The blood on her porch belonged to a man named Silas Creed, a mine supervisor who had made it all the way to her front steps before she had shot him in the leg. He had crawled away screaming threats and promises of return, and Victoria had spent the rest of that night vomiting in her kitchen, shaking so hard she thought her bones might break. She had only meant to stop him, but the violence of it, the reality of pulling that trigger and watching him fall, had carved something hollow out of her chest that she did not know how to fill back up. She had gone to the sheriff the next morning, a useless man named Walcott who had looked at her over his coffee and said, "Well, Miss Vaughan, you are a pretty young thing living all alone out there. Maybe you should consider selling that property and moving into town proper, or better yet, finding yourself a husband." Victoria had walked out of his office with rage burning so hot in her throat she could barely breathe. And she had known then that she was truly alone in this, that whatever happened on her land would be her responsibility to prevent or to survive. She had considered leaving, packing up everything she could carry and taking the stage to Denver or Salt Lake City, starting over somewhere. Her father's memory did not live in every corner of this house. But something stubborn and fierce in her refused to be driven away from the only home she had left, refused to let these men take anything else from her when they had already taken her peace and her sleep, and her ability to walk through her own property without fear climbing her spine. So she stayed and she waited, and she watched the darkness, and she wondered how long she could keep doing this before exhaustion or bad luck betrayed her, and one of them got through. The sound of hoofbeats on the road made her stiffen, her finger sliding to the trigger guard as she tracked the movement through the darkness. But the rider did not turn up her lane. He continued past, and she let out a breath she had not known she was holding, her hands aching from how tightly she gripped the rifle. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would ride into town and ask around for someone who might help her build a fence, Something tall and strong with a gate she could lock. Something that might give her a barrier between herself and the men who kept coming. It would cost money she could barely spare, but she would find a way. She had to find a way. She did not sleep that night, same as all the nights before. She sat in her chair by the window with the rifle across her lap and watched the sun come up over the mosquito range, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose that would have been beautiful if she had any beauty left in her to appreciate them. When full morning arrived, she cleaned herself up as best she could, pinning her hair into a respectable bun and donning her navy riding dress with the split skirt that let her sit a horse properly. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger looking back, a woman with shadows under her eyes deep enough to plant seeds in and a tightness around her mouth that spoke of fear carried too long. The ride into Leadville proper took 30 minutes at an easy pace. The town sprawled across the valley in a confusion of false-fronted buildings, mining operations, and residential streets that ranged from respectable to squalid, depending on which direction you wandered. Harrison Avenue buzzed with activity even at this early hour. Freight wagons hauling ore from the mines, men in work clothes heading to their shifts, women in fine dresses picking their way along the boardwalks between the mud puddles that Leadville's streets became every time it rained. Victoria tied her mare, a gentle sorrel named Penny, to a hitching post outside the general store and went inside, nodding to Mrs. Henderson behind the counter. "Morning, Sarah." "Victoria, dear, you look exhausted. Are you eating enough?" Sarah Henderson was a motherly woman in her 50s who had shown Victoria nothing but kindness since her father's death. "I am eating fine. I am just not sleeping well." Victoria moved to the counter, lowering her voice. "Sarah, do you know anyone who might be willing to help me build a fence around my property? Someone reliable, someone who would not." She trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. Sarah's expression softened with understanding and something that looked like pity. "I heard about the trouble you have been having. It is shameful, truly shameful, that Sheriff Walcott has not done more to help you." She paused, considering. "There is a man who came into town about 2 weeks ago. Name is Tobias Cross. He has been doing odd jobs around town, good honest work from what I hear. Built a new stable for the Hendersons over on Pine Street, repaired the church roof, that sort of thing. He is quiet, keeps to himself, but he is a hard worker and he seems decent enough. Where might I find him?" Victoria felt a small flutter of hope in her chest, the first she had felt in weeks. "He has been staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street, the one Mrs. Carmichael runs. If he is not there, you might check the Silver Dollar. He takes his meals there sometimes." Victoria thanked her and left the store, walking the 3 blocks to Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house. The building was painted a cheerful yellow that seemed at odds with the rough mining town surrounding it, and Mrs. Carmichael herself answered Victoria's knock with a warm smile that faded to concern when she saw who was calling. "Miss Vaughan, are you all right? You look unwell." "I am looking for Tobias Cross. Sarah Henderson said he might be staying here." "He is indeed. Let me fetch him for you, Mrs." Carmichael disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a man following behind her. Tobias Cross was tall, probably 6 feet and a few inches besides, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, muscled build that came from a lifetime of hard physical work. He looked to be in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of aged whiskey. His face was tanned and angular, with a straight nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and a mouth set in a naturally serious line. He wore work clothes, simple denim trousers and a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and there was a quality of stillness about him that Victoria found oddly reassuring. Miss Vaughan, I am Tobias Cross. Mrs. Carmichael says you were looking for me. His voice was deep and quiet, with an accent she could not quite place, something southern maybe, softened by time and travel. Mr. Cross, I am in need of someone to build a fence around my property. Sarah Henderson at the general store said you do good work and that you are. She hesitated, then pushed forward. That you are trustworthy. Something flickered in his eyes, a question maybe, or an understanding. I can build you a fence. How much land are we talking about? 40 acres. The house sits about 100 yards back from the main road. I would need the fence along the front of the property at minimum, with a gate I can secure. And I would need it built quickly, if possible. That is a fair amount of work for one man, but I can do it. Might take 2 weeks, maybe a bit more depending on the materials and the terrain. Would cost you for lumber and hardware, plus my labor. He named a price that made Victoria's stomach clench, but she had expected as much. I can pay half now and half when it is finished. Would that be acceptable? It would. When would you want me to start? As soon as possible. Today, if you can manage it. Tobias studied her for a long moment, and Victoria had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing all the things she was trying to hide, the exhaustion and the fear and the desperation that had brought her here. But when he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact and kind. I can ride out to your place this afternoon, take a look at what we are working with, and start gathering materials. I could begin building tomorrow morning if that suits you. Relief flooded through her so powerfully she felt dizzy. That would suit me very well, Mr. Cross. Thank you. Call me Tobias. No need for formality when we will be working together. He paused. Your place is the old Vaughan homestead out on the North Road, correct? It is. You know it, I know of it. I will be there around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Victoria paid him half the agreed amount, counting out bills from her dwindling savings with fingers that tried not to shake, and then she rode back to her property to wait. She cleaned the blood from her porch with lye soap and scalding water, scrubbing until her hands were raw and the wood was pale and clean. Then she went inside and tried to make the house presentable, suddenly self-conscious about the dishes piled in her kitchen and the dust gathering on her furniture. Tobias arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, riding a sturdy buckskin gelding and leading a pack mule behind him. Victoria met him in the yard, watching as he dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. Afternoon, Miss Vaughan. Afternoon, Tobias, and please call me Victoria. He nodded and began walking the perimeter of her property where she had indicated the fence should go, examining the terrain and making notes in a small leather-bound book he pulled from his pocket. Victoria followed at a distance, watching the way he worked with methodical precision, taking measurements and testing the soil with a shovel he had brought. He spoke little, but when he did, his questions were practical and intelligent. How tall do you want this fence? He asked as they stood near the road. Tall enough that a man cannot easily climb over it. 6 feet, maybe 7. 7 feet is a good height. I will build it solid with posts set deep. The gate will be here at the front, wide enough for a wagon to pass through, with a crossbar and lock on the inside. He looked at her then, his whiskey-colored eyes direct and serious. This fence you are wanting, it is not just for keeping livestock in, is it? Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame and anger mixing in her chest. No, it is for keeping men out. Tobias did not look surprised or judgmental. He simply nodded. Then I will build it strong, and I will build it fast. Thank you. The words felt inadequate for the gratitude swelling in her throat. I am going to head back to town and arrange for the lumber delivery. I will be back at first light tomorrow to start work. He paused, gathering his reins. Will you be all right here tonight? Alone? The concern in his voice was so unexpected and so genuine that Victoria felt tears prick behind her eyes. She blinked them away fiercely. "I have managed this long. I will manage one more night. I do not doubt it." He swung into his saddle with easy strength. "But all the same, I will be here early. You have my word on that." He rode away, and Victoria watched him go with a feeling she could not quite name settling warm and strange beneath her ribs. Hope, maybe, or simply the unfamiliar sensation of not being entirely alone in her struggle. That night, no one came. Victoria sat at her window as always, rifle in her lap, but the darkness remained empty and quiet save for the usual sounds of night creatures and wind through the pines. She told herself it was just luck, just chance, but some small part of her wondered if somehow the universe had decided to give her a reprieve, one peaceful night before the work began. True to his word, Tobias arrived at dawn. Victoria heard the sound of wagon wheels and went out to find him unloading lumber in her front yard, the early morning sun turning his dark hair bronze at the edges. He had brought everything he needed, boards and posts and bags of nails, along with tools and equipment strapped to the side of the wagon. "Morning," he said when he saw her. "I borrowed this wagon from the livery. I will return it once I have everything unloaded. Can I help?" Victoria asked, feeling useless standing there while he worked. "If you would like. Grab that end there." He gestured to a long board, and together they lifted it, carrying it to the edge of where the fence would stand. They worked in companionable silence for the next hour, unloading the wagon and organizing materials. Tobias moved with efficient purpose, never wasting a motion, and Victoria found herself watching the way his muscles shifted beneath his shirt when he lifted the heavier posts. The way sweat began to darken the fabric between his shoulder blades as the sun climbed higher and the mountain air grew warm. When the wagon was empty, Tobias returned it to town and came back on his buckskin, which he turned loose in Victoria's small corral with a flake of hay from his saddlebags. Then he set to work in earnest, measuring and marking where each post would go, digging the first hole with a practiced rhythm that spoke of long experience. Victoria brought him water and tried to stay out of his way, occupying herself with her usual chores, but finding her attention drawn again and again to the man working in her yard. There was something almost meditative about watching him work, something steady and reassuring about the way he approached each task with calm focus. Around midday, she brought him lunch, cold chicken and fresh bread with butter, and a jar of lemonade she had made that morning. Tobias washed his hands at her pump and sat in the shade of her porch to eat, and Victoria found herself sitting beside him, suddenly hungry for human conversation after so many days of solitude and fear. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Your accent sounds southern." "Texas." "Born and raised on a ranch outside San Antonio. Left when I was 17. He took a bite of bread, chewing thoughtfully. "Spent the last 10 years moving around, working where work could be found. Cattle drives, ranch hand positions, construction jobs in towns that were growing too fast to keep up with themselves. Ended up here in Leadville a few weeks back and figured I would stay a while, see if the work held out." "You have family back in Texas?" A shadow crossed his face, brief but noticeable. "Had. My folks died of fever when I was 16 and my brother died in the war. There is nothing left for me there." "I am sorry. I lost my father in a mining accident last year. He was all the family I had left." Victoria wrapped her arms around herself despite the warmth of the day. It is a lonely thing, being untethered like this. Tobias looked at her then, really looked at her, and Victoria felt something pass between them, a recognition of shared grief and shared resilience. "It is," he agreed quietly. But lonely does not have to mean helpless. You are clearly stronger than you might give yourself credit for. I shot a man, Victoria said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Last week. He was trying to break down my door and I shot him in the leg. There was so much blood and he was screaming and I have not been able to stop seeing it every time I close my eyes. Did he die? Tobias asked, his voice careful and neutral. No, he crawled away. But I hurt him badly, and I cannot decide if I feel guilty about it or if I am just angry that I had to do it at all. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses forming from gripping the rifle night after night. The sheriff told me I should get married or move into town. As if the solution to men attacking me is to make myself the property of one man or to hide behind the walls of respectability. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was an edge of anger in his voice that surprised her. That sheriff is a fool and a coward. You did what you had to do to protect yourself, and there is no shame in that. Any man who comes onto your property with ill intent deserves whatever he gets, and you have every right to defend what is yours. The fierce certainty in his words made something tight in Victoria's chest loosen, some knot of shame and doubt that had been choking her for weeks. Thank you for saying that. I have been feeling like maybe I was overreacting, like maybe I was the one doing something wrong. You are not. And once this fence is built, maybe those men will think twice before trying to bother you again. A good, strong fence sends a message, and so does a man camping on your property making sure no one crosses it. Victoria blinked. What do you mean? Tobias met her eyes, his expression serious and determined. I mean that I will sleep here while I am building this fence, out by the gate, where anyone coming up that road will see me before they see your house. It will make them think twice, and it will give you a chance to actually rest instead of keeping watch all night. You would do that. Sleep outside for 2 weeks just to help me feel safe. Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion. It is not just to help you feel safe. It is to make sure you actually are safe. There is a difference. He stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. Now if you will excuse me, I need to get back to work. Daylight is burning and I have a lot of fence to build. He went back to his labor, and Victoria sat on her porch and watched him, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. It took her several minutes to recognize the feeling for what it was. The beginning of hope, and maybe, just maybe, the first stirrings of something deeper. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Tobias laid out his bedroll near where the gate would eventually stand. He had set 4 posts that day, sinking them deep into the rocky soil and tamping them firm, and tomorrow he would begin attaching the rails that would form the fence proper. But for now, he built a small fire and made himself coffee in a battered tin pot, the smell of it drifting across the yard to where Victoria sat on her porch. She had made stew for dinner, more than she could eat alone, and before she could second-guess herself, she ladled a generous portion into a bowl and carried it out to him along with more bread and a fork. You do not have to keep feeding me, Tobias said, but he accepted the bowl with a smile that softened his serious face and made him look younger. But I am not going to pretend I do not appreciate it. This smells wonderful. It is the least I can do when you are sleeping on the ground to protect me. Victoria settled herself on a rock near his fire, propriety be damned. She was tired of being proper and alone. Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit? I would enjoy the company. They ate together as the stars began to appear overhead, brighter here in the mountains than Victoria had ever seen them back east where she had grown up. Tobias told her stories about his time on cattle drives, about rivers that ran red with sunset and storms that could turn the sky green before unleashing hell on earth. Victoria told him about her father, about the way he had loved these mountains despite them killing him, about his dreams of striking silver and making a fortune that would let them live easy for the rest of their days. He never found his silver, she said quietly. But he found something he loved in the work itself, in the challenge of it. I think that mattered more to him than the fortune ever would have. Sounds like he was a good man, Tobias said. He was. He would have liked you, I think. He appreciated people who worked hard and kept their word. I hope I am living up to that. Tobias poured himself more coffee, then offered the pot to Victoria, who shook her head. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask. Why did you stay here after he died? A woman alone, no family, no protection. You could have sold this place and started over somewhere easier. Victoria considered the question, watching the flames dance and spark. I thought about it. I still think about it sometimes. But this is the last place my father was alive, the last place I have that connects me to him. And there is something about these mountains, something that gets into your blood. For all the hardship and the fear, I cannot imagine being anywhere else. Does that make sense? It does. I have felt that way about places myself, though I have never stayed anywhere long enough to put down real roots. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe someday I will find a place that makes me want to stay. Maybe Leadville could be that place, Victoria said, and then felt her cheeks heat at how forward that sounded. I mean, the work seems steady here and the town is growing. Maybe, Tobias said, and there was something in the way he looked at her, something warm and considering that made Victoria's pulse quicken. I am starting to see the appeal of staying put for a while. They sat together until the fire burned down to coals and the night grew cold in the way of mountain evenings even in summer. Finally, Victoria stood, brushing off her skirt. I should let you get some rest. Thank you again for doing this, for all of this. No thanks needed. Sleep well, Victoria. I will be right here if you need anything. Victoria went inside and, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to climb into her bed instead of sitting watch at the window. She left the window open a crack so she could hear if anything happened, but the knowledge that Tobias was out there, that she was not alone in her vigilance, allowed her to finally let go of the tight grip of consciousness she had been maintaining. She slept for 10 hours straight and woke to the sound of a hammer ringing against nails, the rhythm of it steady and sure. When she looked out her window, she saw Tobias already at work, the first rails of the fence beginning to take shape between the posts he had set. The days fell into a pattern after that. Tobias would arrive at dawn and work until dark, taking breaks only to eat the meals Victoria prepared and to rest briefly in the heat of the afternoon. The fence grew steadily, extending along the front of her property in a solid wall of timber that stood 7 feet high and looked strong enough to turn back an army, let alone a drunk miner with bad intentions. Victoria found herself spending more and more time outside, ostensibly to tend her garden or hang laundry, but really just to be near Tobias, to listen to him work, and to steal moments of conversation when he paused to drink water or wipe the sweat from his face. They talked about everything and nothing, about his travels and her childhood back in Pennsylvania, about books they had read and places they wanted to see. Tobias had a quiet intelligence that surprised her, a thoughtfulness in the way he considered questions and answered them that spoke of a man who spent a lot of time thinking. He also had a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments, making Victoria laugh in a way she had not laughed in months. Once, when a board he was cutting split wrong, he looked at it and said, "Well, that is unfortunate," in such a deadpan tone that Victoria nearly choked on her lemonade. Another time, when she brought him lunch and apologized for it being simple fare, He looked at the plate of ham and beans and biscuits and said with perfect seriousness, "Victoria, I once spent 3 weeks on a cattle drive eating nothing but hardtack and regret. This is a feast fit for royalty." At night, he kept his promise and slept beside where the gate would be, his bedroll positioned so anyone coming up the road would have to pass him to get to the house. And no one came. Whether it was his presence or simple luck, Victoria did not know and did not care. All she knew was that she was sleeping through the night for the first time in weeks, and that she was waking up feeling almost human again. But more than just the return of sleep and safety, Victoria was beginning to feel something else, something that made her heart beat faster when Tobias smiled at her, and made her skin feel warm when their hands accidentally brushed passing a tool or a plate of food. She found herself paying more attention to her appearance, pinning her hair more carefully and wearing her nicer dresses, and she caught Tobias looking at her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her breath catch in her throat. She told herself it was foolish, that she barely knew this man, that he would be gone in another week when the fence was finished, and she would probably never see him again. But her heart did not seem to care about logic or sense. Her heart had made its own decision about Tobias Cross, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of her had to acknowledge it. On the 8th day of work, a man came up the road around noon. Victoria saw him from her kitchen window and felt her stomach drop, recognizing him as one of the miners who drank at the Silver Dollar, and who had made crude comments to her the last time she had been in town. She grabbed her rifle and went to the door, but Tobias had already seen him and was walking to intercept him before he got close to the house. Victoria could not hear what was said, but she saw Tobias standing with his arms crossed, saw the miner gesture angrily and then point toward the house. Tobias shook his head, said something short and sharp, and the miner took a step back. More words were exchanged, and then the miner turned and left, casting one last look over his shoulder that made Victoria's skin crawl. Tobias walked back to where he had been working, but Victoria came out to meet him, rifle still in her hands. What did he want? He wanted to know who I was and what I was doing here. I told him I was working for you and that your property was no longer open for uninvited visitors. Tobias picked up his hammer, his jaw tight. He suggested that you did not need a fence so much as you needed a man to keep you in line. I suggested that he remove himself from your property before I did it for him. Victoria felt anger surge hot and bright in her chest. That is the third man this week who has come by to see what you are doing here. Word is spreading in town that I hired someone to build this fence, and they do not like it. Let them not like it. This is your land and you have every right to protect it however you see fit. Tobias set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. Victoria, I need to tell you something. Last night at the saloon I heard some men talking. They were talking about you, about how you have been causing trouble by shooting Sela's Creed, and how someone needs to teach you a lesson about your place. I was going to tell you this morning, but I did not want to frighten you before I had a chance to think about how to handle it. Fear, cold and familiar, slithered down Victoria's spine. What kind of lesson? The kind that involves several of them coming out here together. The kind where they think there is safety in numbers. Tobias's face was grim. I do not know when they are planning this, but from the way they were talking, it sounded like it might be soon, maybe as soon as this weekend. Victoria felt the world tilt sideways, felt the fragile sense of safety she had been building over the past week crumble like sand. I cannot fight off multiple men, even with you here. We would be outnumbered, which is why we are not going to fight them. Tobias reached out and took the rifle gently from her hands, setting it aside. We are going to go to the marshal in Denver. The federal marshal, not that useless sheriff here in Leadville. We are going to report what has been happening and get proper law enforcement involved before this escalates any further. Denver is a day's ride from here. We would have to leave immediately, and even then, would a marshal believe me? Would he care about what happens to one woman in a mining town? He will care because what is happening to you is a crime, and because I will make sure he understands the seriousness of the situation. Tobias's voice was steady and certain. Pack what you need for a few days. We leave within the hour. I will finish this fence when we get back, and I will sleep beside that gate every night until those men are arrested or scared off for good. But right now, the most important thing is getting you somewhere safe and getting proper authorities involved. Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she would not be driven from her home, but the memory of those men and their threats was too fresh and her fear was too real. She nodded, swallowing hard. All right, let me pack. She went inside and threw clothes and necessities into a carpet bag with shaking hands, moving quickly and trying not to think too hard about what she was doing or what it meant. When she came back out, Tobias had already saddled both their horses and was securing his tools in her barn. I am leaving my materials here, he said. We will be back in a few days and I will finish the work. This is not me abandoning the job. This is me making sure you are safe so I can actually finish it. I know. I trust you. The words came out more intense than Victoria had intended, weighted with all the emotion churning in her chest. Tobias looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, softened. I am going to keep you safe, Victoria. I promise you that. They rode out together, heading south toward Denver with the summer sun hot on their backs and the mountains rising like sentinels around them. The journey would take them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in Colorado, and under different circumstances, Victoria might have enjoyed the adventure of it. But as it was, she could only think about the home she was leaving behind and the men who wanted to hurt her, and she held onto her reins with white-knuckled hands and tried to keep breathing. They rode in silence for the first few hours, both lost in their own thoughts. The road wound down from Leadville's high elevation through forests of pine and aspen, following the course of a creek that ran silver and cold over smooth stones. They passed other travelers, freight wagons and stage coaches and men on horseback, and each time Victoria tensed, expecting trouble, but no one bothered them. Around mid-afternoon, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of bread and cheese Victoria had packed. They sat beside the creek, the sound of rushing water filling the silence between them. Can I ask you something? Victoria said finally, watching the way sunlight caught in the spray of the creek. Anything. Why are you doing this? Why are you going so far out of your way to help me? You could have just built the fence and collected your money and moved on. You did not have to sleep outside my house every night, and you certainly did not have to take me all the way to Denver to find a marshal. So why are you? Tobias was quiet for a long time, long enough that Victoria thought maybe he was not going to answer. But finally he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. Because what is happening to you is wrong, and I have spent too much of my life watching wrong things happen and doing nothing about them. Because you deserve to feel safe in your own home, and because no one else seems willing to make sure that happens. He paused, picking up a stone and turning it over in his hands. And because from the moment I met you, I saw someone who was scared but refusing to give up, someone who was fighting with everything she had even though she was exhausted and alone. That kind of courage deserves to be supported, not taken advantage of. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. I do not feel very courageous. Mostly I just feel tired and angry. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what needs to be done even though you are afraid. You have been doing that for weeks now, and it has taken a toll on you, I can see that. But you have not broken, and you have not run until now, when running is actually the smart choice." He looked at her then, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I admire you, Victoria, more than I think you realize." "I admire you too," she said quietly. "You are one of the few truly good men I have ever known." "I am not sure about good, but I try to be decent when I can." He stood, offering her his hand. "We should keep moving. I want to make it to the way station before dark so we can sleep under a roof tonight." Victoria took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, and she did not let go immediately when she was standing. His hand was calloused and warm, strong in a way that made her feel safe rather than threatened, and when he squeezed her fingers gently before releasing them, she felt that warmth spread all the way through her chest. They reached the way station just as the sun was setting, a rough building that offered beds and meals to travelers on the Denver road. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Hutchins, showed them to separate rooms and served them dinner in a small dining area that smelled of wood smoke and fried meat. There were other travelers there, a family heading to Denver and a pair of businessmen talking loudly about mining investments, but Victoria barely noticed them. She was too aware of Tobias sitting across from her, too conscious of the fact that for the first time since they had met, they would be sleeping under the same roof, even if in different rooms. After dinner, they sat on the porch of the way station and watched the stars come out. The air was cool at this elevation, and Victoria wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, grateful for the warmth. "What will you do if the marshal cannot help?" Tobias asked quietly. "Or if he can help but it takes time for the law to catch up with those men?" "I do not know," Victoria admitted. "I suppose I will have to decide whether staying in Leadville is worth the risk, or whether I need to sell the property and start over somewhere else." "Where would you go?" "I have no idea. Denver maybe, or further west to California. Somewhere big enough that I can disappear into the crowd, somewhere I do not have to be afraid every time I hear footsteps outside my door." She sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "I do not want to leave. That house is all I have left of my father, but I am so tired of being afraid." "I understand that. I hope it does not come to you having to leave. But whatever you decide, I want you to know that you have options. You are not trapped, even if it feels that way right now." "Thank you." Victoria turned to look at him, at his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "Can I ask you something else? Something personal you can always ask. Is there anyone waiting for you somewhere? A woman, I mean. Someone you are planning to go back to when you finish this job?" The question felt bold, too bold maybe, but Victoria needed to know. Tobias turned to meet her eyes, and even in the dim light she could see the intensity of his gaze. "No, there is no one. There has not been anyone in a long time. I have not stayed anywhere long enough to build that kind of connection, and most of the women I have met were either already spoken for or not interested in a drifter with no prospects." He paused. "Why do you ask?" "Because I need to know if what I am feeling is something I should be fighting or something I should allow myself to feel." The words tumbled out before Victoria could stop them, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "I need to know if I am alone in this, or if you feel it too." Tobias went very still, his eyes searching her face. "What are you feeling, Victoria? Like you are the first person in a very long time who has seen me as something more than a problem to be solved or a prize to be won. Like when you smile at me, the whole world gets a little brighter. Like the thought of you leaving when the fence is finished makes me want to cry, even though I barely know you and I have no right to feel that way." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly vulnerable and exposed. "I am feeling things I should not be feeling for someone I hired to build a fence, and I do not know what to do about it." Tobias reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and cupped her face in his hand, his palm warm against her cheek. "You are not alone in this. I have been fighting what I feel since the day I met you, telling myself it was not my place to feel anything beyond professional courtesy. But the truth is that I think about you all the time. I think about your courage and your kindness and the way you laugh when something surprises you. I think about how much I want to keep you safe and how much I want to be the reason you smile instead of the reason you are afraid." "I am not afraid of you," Victoria whispered, leaning into his touch. "You are the only thing I am not afraid of." "Good." Tobias's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a touch so gentle it made her ache. "Because I would never hurt you, Victoria. Not ever. I know." And she did know with a certainty that went bone deep. Whatever else happened, whatever difficulties lay ahead, Tobias Cross was a man she could trust with her safety and maybe with her heart. They sat there for a long moment, the night air cool around them and his hand warm against her face, and Victoria felt something shift and settle into place inside her chest, something that felt like coming home. Finally, Tobias pulled back, though he looked reluctant to do so. "We should both get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." "It is." Victoria stood, feeling suddenly shy and uncertain. "Good night, Tobias." "Good night, Victoria. Sleep well." She went to her room and lay awake for a long time, her hand pressed to her cheek where he had touched her, her heart full of equal parts hope and fear. She was falling in love with Tobias Cross, if she had not already fallen completely, and she had no idea if that was the bravest thing she had ever done or the most foolish. They reached Denver the following afternoon, having left the way station at dawn and ridden hard through the morning. The city sprawled across the prairie like a promise kept, bigger and more bustling than Leadville, with wide streets and brick buildings and the sound of industry echoing from every direction. Victoria had been to Denver once before with her father, but it still awed her, this evidence of civilization carved out of the wilderness. The federal marshal's office was located in a solid stone building downtown, and Tobias tied their horses outside before escorting Victoria up the steps and through the door. Inside, a clerk sat at a desk, looking up with bored curiosity as they entered. "We need to see the marshal," Tobias said. "It is urgent. Marshal Brennan is occupied at the moment. If you would care to wait, we will wait," Tobias said firmly, and guided Victoria to a bench along the wall. They sat for nearly an hour before a door opened and a man emerged, tall and gray-haired with a badge pinned to his vest. He looked at them with sharp blue eyes and said, "You are the folks who need to see me." "Yes, sir. My name is Tobias Cross and this is Miss Victoria Vaughan. We need to report a situation that local law enforcement has refused to handle." Marshal Brennan studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Come into my office." They followed him into a small room lined with filing cabinets and maps, and the marshal sat behind his desk and gestured for them to sit as well. "All right, tell me what is going on." Victoria took a deep breath and began to speak, telling him everything. She told him about the men who had been coming to her property, about the escalating threats and violence, about shooting Sela's Creed in self-defense. She told him about the sheriff in Leadville who had dismissed her concerns and suggested she get married or move. She told him about the conversation Tobias had overheard in the saloon, about the plan for multiple men to come teach her a lesson. Marshal Brennan listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story progressed. When Victoria finished, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers, his jaw tight. "That sheriff you mentioned, Walcott. He is a political appointee, got the job because he knew the right people, not because he has any business enforcing the law. I have had complaints about him before, but nothing concrete enough to act on." He looked at Victoria. "You did the right thing coming to me. What is happening to you is criminal harassment at minimum and attempted assault given what you have described. The fact that local law enforcement has failed to protect you is unacceptable." "Can you help her?" Tobias asked, leaning forward intently. "Can you stop these men before they do something worse?" "I can and I will. I am going to deputize a couple of men and ride to Leadville with you. We will make arrests, and we will make it very clear that this behavior will not be tolerated in any town under federal jurisdiction." He stood, already moving toward the door. "Give me a few hours to get organized, and we will leave first thing in the morning. In the meantime, I suggest you both get some rest and a hot meal. Do you have a place to stay in Denver?" "We can find a hotel," Tobias said. "Try the Grand on Larimer Street. Tell them Marshal Brennan sent you and they will give you a fair rate." He shook both their hands, his grip firm and reassuring. "You did the right thing coming here, Miss Vaughan. I am sorry it took things getting this bad before proper help arrived, but I promise you, we will resolve this." Victoria felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Marshal. Thank you so much." They left the office and found the Grand Hotel, a respectable establishment with clean rooms and a dining room that smelled of roast beef and fresh bread. Tobias paid for 2 rooms again, propriety maintained even as Victoria found herself wishing they did not have to be separate, wishing she could fall asleep beside him and wake up knowing he was there. They ate dinner together, and the relief of having official help finally coming made the food taste better and the conversation flow easier. Tobias told her more stories of his travels, and Victoria found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in what felt like years, the weight of constant fear finally lifting enough for her to breathe freely. After dinner, they walked through the streets of Denver as the sun set, looking in shop windows and watching the city settle into evening. Tobias bought her a peppermint stick from a candy shop, and Victoria ate it slowly, savoring the sweet burn of it on her tongue. "I could get used to this," she said as they walked. "Having someone to talk to, someone to share meals with. It is nice having company." "It is," Tobias agreed. "I have been alone for so long I almost forgot what it felt like to have someone to care about." He glanced at her. "But I am remembering now, and I find I like it quite a bit." "When this is all over," Victoria said carefully, "when the marshal has dealt with those men and the fence is finished, what will you do? Will you stay in Leadville, or will you move on to the next job?" Tobias stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The street around them bustled with evening activity, but in that moment it felt like they were the only 2 people in the world. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether I have a reason to stay." His eyes were serious, intent on hers. "I am tired of drifting, Victoria. I am tired of moving from place to place with no roots and no one to come home to. I think maybe it is time I found somewhere to settle down, somewhere I could build something that lasts. But I do not want to do that alone, and I do not want to assume that you want the same thing I want." Victoria's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. "What do you want, Tobias?" "I want to finish building your fence. I want to help you make that property safe and prosperous. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are there, and I want to fall asleep every night with you beside me. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I am in love with you, Victoria Vaughan, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me with your heart." Tears were streaming down Victoria's face now, but they were good tears, happy tears, the kind that came from joy too big to contain. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you promised to build my fence strong and fast, and I have been falling ever since. Yes, Tobias. Yes to all of it. Yes to everything. He pulled her close and kissed her then, right there on the street with Denver moving around them and the stars beginning to come out overhead. It was a gentle kiss, tender and full of promise, and Victoria felt the last of her fear and loneliness crack apart and fall away, replaced by something bright and warm and infinitely precious. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers and smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Victoria had ever seen. "We are going to be all right," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we are going to be all right because we have each other." "I know," Victoria whispered back. "I know." They returned to the hotel hand in hand, and though they still retired to separate rooms, Victoria fell asleep easily for the first time in months, her heart full of hope and love and the absolute certainty that her life had just changed for the better. The next morning, they met Marshal Brennan and his 2 deputies at the edge of town, and began the journey back to Leadville. The marshal was a man of few words but decisive action, and he spent much of the ride discussing strategy with his deputies and asking Victoria pointed questions about the men who had been harassing her. She described them as best she could, giving names where she knew them and descriptions where she did not, and the marshal made notes in a small book he kept in his vest pocket. They reached Leadville late in the afternoon, and the marshal immediately went to work. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he had a short, sharp conversation with Sheriff Walcott that ended with the sheriff looking pale and shaken. His second stop was the Silver Dollar Saloon, where he walked in with his deputies and emerged 15 minutes later with 3 men in handcuffs, including Silas Creed, whose leg was still bandaged from where Victoria had shot him. Word spread through town like wildfire, and by evening a crowd had gathered outside the jail to watch as the marshal made more arrests, rounding up every man Victoria identified as having come to her property or threatened her. Some of them went quietly. Others protested loudly, claiming they had done nothing wrong, but the marshal was unmoved and unbending. "You are being charged with criminal harassment, trespassing, and attempted assault," he told them in a voice loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "You will be transported to Denver to stand trial, and if you are found guilty, you will serve time in federal prison. Let this be a lesson to every man in this town. Women are not property to be claimed or conquered. They have the same rights as any man to live in peace and safety, and anyone who violates those rights will answer to federal law." Victoria stood with Tobias at the edge of the crowd and watched the proceedings with a sense of vindication so powerful it made her knees weak. These men had terrorized her for weeks, had made her afraid in her own home, and now they were finally facing consequences for their actions. When the last arrest was made, and the men were locked securely in cells to await transport to Denver, Marshal Brennan came to find Victoria and Tobias. "That should take care of the immediate problem," he said. "I am leaving one of my deputies here for the next few weeks to make sure there are no reprisals and to keep an eye on Sheriff Walcott. If you have any further trouble, Miss Vaughan, you send word to me in Denver and I will be here within a day." "Thank you, Marshal. I cannot tell you what this means to me." Victoria shook his hand, her gratitude profound and genuine. "You are welcome. And Miss Vaughan, for what it is worth, you did nothing wrong. You defended yourself and your property, and that took courage. Do not let anyone make you feel ashamed of that." He tipped his hat to them both and headed back toward the jail, leaving Victoria and Tobias standing in the street as the crowd dispersed. "It is over," Victoria said, the words sinking in slowly. It is actually over. It is, Tobias agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Now we can focus on the future instead of just surviving the present. They returned to Victoria's property as the sun was setting, and Tobias immediately went back to work on the fence, determined to finish what he had started. Victoria helped where she could, holding boards steady while he nailed them in place, handing him tools and hardware as he needed them. They worked together in comfortable silence, and there was something deeply satisfying about building something with her hands, about creating this barrier that would keep her safe and mark her boundaries. The fence was completed 3 days later, a solid wall of timber 7 feet high with a gate in front that swung on heavy iron hinges and locked with a sturdy crossbar. Tobias stepped back to admire his work, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "That should do it," he said with satisfaction. "Nothing is getting through that fence without making a lot of noise and a lot of effort." Victoria walked along the length of it, running her hand over the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship and the sheer solidity of it. "It is perfect." "Thank you, Tobias, for this and for everything else. You do not have to keep thanking me. I wanted to do this." He came to stand beside her, looking out over the property. "So what happens now? Now we figure out how to build a life together." Victoria turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "I want you to stay, Tobias, not just for a few more days, but permanently. I want you to live here with me, to help me work this land and make it into something good. I know it is not much, just 40 acres of rocky ground and a small house, but it could be ours. We could make it into a home." "I would like that," Tobias said softly. "I would like that very much, but there is one thing we need to do first." "What is that?" "We need to get married." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know we have only known each other for a few weeks, and I know some people will say we are rushing into this, but I do not care what they think. I love you, and I want to marry you properly before we start living as man and wife. I want to do this right." Joy bloomed in Victoria's chest, bright and overwhelming. "I want that too. I want to be your wife, Tobias Cross. I want to build a life with you and have a family with you and grow old with you. Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married a week later in a small ceremony at the church in Leadville, with Mrs. Henderson and Sarah from the general store serving as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple dress of cream-colored muslin that she had sewn herself, and Tobias wore his best shirt and a vest borrowed from the boarding house proprietor. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her with such tender joy that Victoria felt her heart might burst from happiness. They had a modest celebration dinner at the boarding house, paid for by Mrs. Carmichael as a wedding gift, and then they rode back to their property, to the house that was now truly theirs together. Tobias carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests, and they stood in the main room of the house holding each other close, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. "I love you, Mrs. Cross," Tobias said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I love you too, Mr. Cross, more than I ever thought possible." That night, they shared a bed for the first time as husband and wife, and in the intimacy and tenderness of that joining, Victoria felt the last pieces of her fear and pain fall away, replaced by love and trust and the profound sense of being cherished. Tobias was gentle and patient, making sure she felt safe and loved at every moment, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home, not in this house or this land, but in him. The months that followed were the happiest of Victoria's life. Tobias proved to be not only a skilled builder but also a talented rancher, and together they turned Victoria's 40 acres into a working homestead. They bought cattle with the money Victoria had saved and the wages Tobias had earned, and they built a proper barn and expanded the corral. Tobias taught Victoria how to rope and brand, and Victoria taught Tobias how to make a garden flourish in the rocky mountain soil. They worked from dawn until dusk most days, but it was good work, satisfying work, the kind that left them tired but content. They took their meals together and talked about their plans for the future, about the livestock they wanted to raise and the improvements they wanted to make to the property. They made love often and tenderly, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patience and joy. As autumn turned the aspens gold and winter's first snows began to dust the peaks, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She told Tobias one evening as they sat by the fire, his arms around her and her head on his shoulder. "We are going to have a baby," she said quietly, one hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Come spring, we are going to be parents." Tobias went very still, and then he turned her in his arms so he could see her face, his eyes shining with tears and wonder. "Are you certain?" "I am certain." "Are you happy about it?" "Happy does not begin to cover what I am feeling right now." He kissed her deeply, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "We are going to have a family, Victoria. A real family. We already are a family," she said, smiling through her own tears. "But soon we will be a bigger one." The winter passed slowly, with snow piling high outside and the two of them cozy and warm inside their home. Tobias cut firewood and repaired equipment and built a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving their initials into the headboard. Victoria sewed baby clothes and knitted blankets and tried not to worry too much about the birth, about whether everything would go well. In early April, as the snow began to melt and the first wildflowers pushed up through the wet earth, Victoria went into labor. Tobias rode to town to fetch the midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Schultz, who had delivered half the babies in Leadville. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Mrs. Schultz was skilled and patient, and Tobias stayed by Victoria's side the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born, a healthy baby with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair. Mrs. Schultz cleaned him and wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in Victoria's arms, and Victoria looked down at her child and felt love so overwhelming it stole her breath. "He is perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Tobias, he is perfect." "He is," Tobias agreed, his own voice thick with emotion as he looked at his son for the first time. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but now, looking at this tiny, perfect person they had created, Victoria knew exactly what his name should be. "Samuel. Samuel Thomas Cross, after my father and after you." "Samuel," Tobias repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, son." The baby's early months were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Victoria had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been so happy, watching her son grow and change, seeing Tobias transform into a devoted father who sang lullabies in his deep voice and paced the floor at night when Samuel was fussy. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Victoria and Tobias continued to build their homestead, adding more cattle and a small flock of chickens, planting a larger garden and building a root cellar to store their harvest. The property that had once been a source of fear and isolation became a place of productivity and joy, a home in every sense of the word. When Samuel was 2 years old, Victoria became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after the wild roses that grew along the fence line every summer. Rose was quieter than her brother, a contemplative baby with Tobias's serious eyes and Victoria's auburn hair, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Samuel learned to ride before he learned to read, sitting in front of Tobias on the buckskin and laughing with delight as they rode the property together. Rose proved to have a talent for growing things, and by the time she was 5, she had her own small garden that she tended with fierce dedication. The fence that Tobias had built all those years ago still stood strong and sturdy, a testament to his craftsmanship, and a reminder of how they had found each other. Victoria sometimes stood at the gate and remembered those terrible weeks before Tobias arrived, remembered the fear and the loneliness and the desperation. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, like something that had happened to a different person. She and Tobias had built a good life together, a life based on love and trust and mutual respect. They worked as partners in everything, making decisions together and supporting each other through the inevitable challenges that came with ranching and raising children. They still made time for each other, stealing moments of intimacy and connection amid the chaos of family life. And the love between them only grew deeper and stronger with each passing year. Their children grew, Samuel into a tall, serious young man who loved working with the cattle and dreamed of expanding their operation, and Rose into a bright, spirited girl who could charm anyone she met, and had inherited her mother's stubbornness along with her father's quiet strength. Victoria and Tobias watched them with pride and amazement, marveling at the people they were becoming. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tobias took Victoria on a picnic to the spot where the fence met the road, the place where he had first slept to keep her safe all those years ago. They sat on a blanket and ate cold chicken and fresh bread and drank wine from tin cups, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "You ever regret it?" Tobias asked, taking her hand. "Staying here, marrying me, building this life? Do you ever wonder what might have been if you had sold the property and moved away?" "Never," Victoria said firmly. "Not even once. This life we have built together, this family, this home, it is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it. You saved me, Tobias. Not just from those men, but from a life of loneliness and fear. You gave me a reason to stay and fight for what was mine." "You saved me too," Tobias said softly. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, moving from place to place with no purpose and no roots. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to finally settle down. You gave me everything that matters." They kissed as the sun set, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Around them, the fence stood strong and sure, marking the boundaries of the land they had claimed and the life they had made. Beyond the gate, the road stretched away into the distance, but neither of them had any desire to follow it. Everything they needed, everything they loved, was right here. Years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joys and triumphs. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over and brought her home to the property, building a house on the far corner of the land with Tobias's help. Rose eventually married a mining engineer, a good man who reminded Victoria of her father, and they moved to Leadville proper but visited often, bringing their own children to run and play on the land where Rose had grown up. Victoria and Tobias grew older together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but the love between them never diminished. They still held hands when they walked, still shared private smiles across the dinner table, still found joy in the simple fact of being together. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, watching their family grow and flourish, seeing their legacy take root in the children and grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward. On a warm summer evening in their 40th year of marriage, Victoria and Tobias sat on their porch and watched the sun set over the mountains they had called home for so long. They were in their 60s now, still healthy but feeling the weight of all those years of hard work and mountain living. Samuel ran the ranch now with his sons helping him, and the property had grown to over 200 acres of productive land. "We did well," Victoria said, leaning against Tobias's shoulder. "We took something broken and afraid and turned it into something strong and good." "We did," Tobias agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat, every moment of it, just to end up here with you. I love you, Tobias Cross. I have loved you since the day you promised to build my fence strong and fast, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond. I love you too, Victoria Cross. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and being your husband has been the greatest privilege of my life." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, two people who had found each other in the midst of fear and darkness and chosen to build a life of love and light. The fence still stood at the edge of their property, weathered by time but as solid as the day Tobias built it, and beyond the gate the world continued to change and evolve. But here, in this place they had claimed and nurtured, everything that mattered most remained constant: love, family, home. As they finally rose to go inside for the night, walking slowly hand in hand, Victoria looked back one last time at the fence line, at the gate where Tobias had slept all those years ago to keep her safe. It had been the beginning of everything, the moment when their lives had intersected and changed course forever. The cowboy had built a fence and slept beside the gate, and in doing so, he had given her back her peace, her safety, and ultimately her heart. And she, in turn, had given him a home and a family and a love that would last forever. It was a good ending, Victoria thought as they stepped inside and closed the door behind them. No, not an ending at all, but a continuation of the story they had been writing together all these years. A story of courage and love and the profound power of two people choosing each other, day after day, year after year, for the rest of their lives.